If you allow me, I will start. And as a first note, I wanted to really wish a very peaceful holy month of Ramadan. As you know, depending on the position of the moon in different part of the world, it already started. Here in the United States, it started yesterday evening. And so this is the first opportunity for UNITAR to convey to you this message, and I hope you this peaceful month of Ramadan. We are very happy to launch the first session of the QCPR training sessions for 2020 that, as you know, will encompass modules. We also hope that sooner than later we will be able to meet in a different scenario, and we can be together in a safe and responsible environment in our home, the United Nations. I also wanted to recognize the support and commitment of the Permanent Mission of Switzerland to the United Nations, which has been always supporting our capacity building and training, in particular in the area of social development. Also, I wanted to recognize the work being done with us together as a partner by Unds and the Office of the Deputy Secretary General, His Excellency Amina Mohamed. I think that without this interinstitutional framework, we will not be able to be having this video conference today. COVID-19 has changed our way of work, our way of life, but here we are, resilient, and with adaptability, information technology has permitted us to deliver this video conference in this interinstitutional effort, hoping that UNITAR is able, with our partners, to deliver to you quality service and information, in particular to the delegates that are joining this video conference today. I have the privilege and the honor actually to welcome and present His Excellency Ambassador Joe Glover, Permanent Representative of Switzerland to the United Nations. And I'll take the opportunity, following instructions and my personal heart from the Executive Director of Nikhil said, to please convey, Ambassador, to your authorities our gratitude for the support you have given to UNITAR, not only in New York, but also in Geneva headquarters, which is our home. And I'm happy to convey that all United Nations UNITAR staff feels really safe in there, and Nikhil asked me to convey that to you. There has not been any casualties or cases in our family, but he wanted me to reassure that. Support this initiative with this ambassador help us to level in the playing field in the implementation of the Agenda 2030, as well as to the Sustainable Development Goals, and will help the delegates to navigate and prepare for having a sound QCPR follow-up in 2020, following the 2016 such a remarkable decision-making process. The QCPR today, during this current health crisis, made it more than ever its development an indispensable tool to achieve humankind's aspiration of a sustainable environment and a better future, in particular for 6 countries and for LDCs. Excellency, at this point, I will yield to you the format of the camera and the mic for your introductory remarks, and for also welcoming and properly introduce our keynote speakers today. Excellency, I'm very happy to see you, and I yield the mic and camera to you.
Thank you very much, Marco, for your kind words, and good news also about the staff of UNITAR in Geneva and in other places. Good morning, dear participants, to all of you. Hello from New York, those who are somewhere else. Good morning, panelists. I hope that this finds all of you and your families in good health and dealing with what we have to deal with these days. It's really a pleasure for me and a privilege also to welcome you to this training course on QCPR. And I would like to start by thanking UNITAR, Marco, you and your fantastic team for your willingness, but also your skillfulness to organize this course in spite of the current circumstances. As all of you probably know, the first course in this series should have taken place a month ago on 26 March. But even this not being ideal, I'm very pleased that we are able to hold the course now in this virtual form. I also would like to thank all the speakers and panelists who are making themselves available for this and the following courses. We found in the past, when we started these trainings on QCPR, that the perspective of the panelists, who are people who have a practical experience and bring in additional views, was very helpful to the participants. Now, maybe before I start, let me say a few words on where we are with this the QCPR and what environment we find ourselves in. As you know, it started in 1981. Since 1981, the UN system has been reflecting regularly on its operational activities in the development area. Until 2012, we did so every 3 years. We called that the TCPR, the triennial review. And since 2012, we've been doing this in the form of QCPR every 4 years. Every 4 years, member states are discussing the relevant issues. They try to give guidance and take decisions in order to adapt and improve the work of the UN development system. The last QCPR in 2016, and honestly, it feels surreal that it's already been 4 years since then. The last QCPR came right after the adoption of the SDGs. And it was our opportunity, the member states' opportunity, to make the UN development system fit for purpose, meaning to adapt the structures in order to maximize the system's support to the member states for their efforts in implementing the SDGs. And I think we can say now with some level of satisfaction that the UNDS reform we launched with the QCPR has been concluded, and I will maybe repeat this again when the DSG is with us, because she played such an eminent role in this, and I think we're really happy where we are. Now, the next QCPR, the one we are talking about now, the imminent one, obviously, and it's nothing new for any of us, comes right into this COVID-19 pandemic. At this point, when I see you all sitting, many of you sitting at home, it's clear that most of us, me included, we are still grappling with the immediate impact of this virus. How do we ourselves organize our lives and the lives of our families and next of kin to deal with the impact of this virus? But also what can we do in our respective jobs, every one of us, to strengthen the UN system in its immediate response to the crisis? Now, obviously, we cannot stop there. We cannot stop there. We have to think about the next steps, and we also have to think about the role of the UN once the immediate COVID response is over. So in this forthcoming QCPR, this one we're talking about, it will be our opportunity, but also our responsibility to do exactly that. How should the new structures of the UN development system that we established or reformed over the last 4 years, how should they be used in order to maximize their efficiency and effectiveness in support of the member states, who will have to face multiple fallouts of this current pandemic? At this point in time, it is obviously hard to imagine what the world will look like in a few months, let alone in 4 years. But the preparations and negotiations of this QCPR are all the more important. They're challenging, but they're really important. Marcus, my colleague from the Swiss mission, who is with us and who is our QCPR expert, he is a sailor, he has a sailboat. But we were discussing on what would be a good method to go about the QCPR negotiations, and he suggested this image of a balloon driver And I thought it was a very good image. And I like to use that image for a moment. If you are in a balloon, I've never done it, but if I think that's the vision it gives you. If you're in a balloon high above the ground, the details become smaller and smaller, or they vanish altogether, and suddenly you will have a sense, you have a view of the bigger structure, of the bigger landscape. And we believe, and I agree with my colleague Marcus, that during the QCPR preparations and negotiations, you, the delegates, will be some sort of balloon drivers. You have to be, because you have to get the bigger picture and think about the wider perspectives. You may have to calibrate the height of your balloon drive because you don't want to go too far away from the details, but you have to get a bigger picture. So these training sessions we're offering now, thanks to UNITAR, they should prepare you in a way as balloon drivers. They should provide the necessary maps and analysis, help you use the relevant instruments and build on knowledge and integrate specific perspectives to navigate that balloon, meaning to navigate the QCPR process. The QCPR negotiations will require the capacity and competence to see beyond the usual horizon, to be aware of and to use the current trends and to agree on a common understanding of how the UN is supporting member states to respond to the challenges at hand and to shape the future we want. And this is why we have chosen the title of this training session, Realizing the Future We Want. So I wish you all an interesting course together with our friends from UNITAR, and an exciting journey later on as balloon drivers of this process. Madam Deputy Secretary General, thank you so much for joining us. Your day must be really hell. We were talking about earlier how these working conditions completely blur the line between work and not work. There is just no more no work at all.
Structural decision right now.
Emails and messages 24/7. It's crazy. I also mentioned, Madam DSG, that the crucial role you played around the last QCPR. You were instrumental in bringing this SDGs about, and the last QCPR was about how to change or to modify the structures of the development system to make it fit for the purpose of implementing the SDGs. You were then instrumental in driving the UNDS reform, and now you're one of the foremost leaders in bringing about the development system and the wider system's response to the pandemic we're seeing developing. And I mentioned to colleagues here, of course, everybody's very well aware that this QCPR also has to help the system to respond to the manifold challenges that the pandemic has already had and will have in the future. So, Madam Deputy Secretary General, again, thank you very much. We could not have wished for a better keynote speaker for this event. Thank you for taking the time, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lauber. Thank you, Excellencies, colleagues and friends. I hope that everyone is as well as can be, and I just want to deeply appreciate that the new way of working has really, as you said, got us blurring lines. That then means that people are doing a lot more work than I think we've ever done before. And so to thank everyone for making sure that the UN remains open for business. And I think it's what we're seeing today in the UN's response globally is a tribute to member states' confidence and support in accompanying us through the reforms that we've had. Really, really happy, and thank you to our hosts, Switzerland and UNITAR, for convening this meeting. It's happening at a critical time. I know that we've been trying to make it happen for a long time. Experts in ECOSOC and the second committee, for me, on the front lines of multilateralism, and it's always been the constituency I know has helped to shape the ambition that PRs have been able to put forward when we come to every single session that we have. And so I deeply appreciate the role that they play and will need to play in a very different post-COVID world. It's going to require quite a lot of courage and imagination and co-creation and diplomacy like you've never known it. to really make sure that it's not just the UN development system that is fit for purpose, but that we're going to see a UN that needs to be more responsive, and a world out there that will have very high expectations of a space where everyone's voice can be heard and solutions to the very many challenges be done in a better way together. For us, I think that the member states have managed to transform the UN development system in the space of a single QCPR, and you know, that's incredible. Seeing how quickly we have been able to turn around and respond to member states' expectations is that, as I said, we have the experts. You know, this session I hope will go further, because I think the next QCPR is going to be one that not only talks about implementation, but implementation in a new norm of how we are going to be responding globally, from countries to the regional level to the global setting on our development issues. We are in a transition from the landmark QCPR that led to the reforms, and the new one will set foundations, and I hope, as we say, to overcome COVID. But more importantly, while COVID may have sort of put a pause button on the world, it really hasn't done so on things like climate change, on inequalities, on the very issues that we were trying to accelerate as we were starting this year with the decade on the 2030 agenda. So we keep that at the fore all the time, that what it is that we stitch onto our fabric is that the 2030 agenda is that fabric. And here again, solidarity, continued commitment, staying the course, and finding ways to keep up creatively with the intergovernmental timelines to advance the work of the organization. I was asked yesterday, you know, do I think that the GA is going to hold in September? Absolutely, I think so. Will every head of state be there? I'm not sure, because we know that this pandemic is going to go on for much longer. As it moves from the north, it will go to the south, and that's when many developing countries will be challenged greater. But we will find a creative way to make sure that RGA holds, and that we show the world that not even COVID will defeat the unity of multilateralism. Coming to the journey so far, I mean, really, the work we've done in the last 3 years has, for one, reaffirmed the centrality of QCPR as the main tool for member states' guidance and the system-wide support to sustainable development. And in many ways, you've shown to the world the unique value of this really quirky acronym. In fact, I think we love the acronym because if somebody asks us to say what it is, it's such a tongue twister. But when I first came back, it seemed to me that the QCPR had been through some rough waters in 2016. 2017, we got ourselves a QCPR to implement. And I'm not sure at that time whether, in fact, the system was as respectful of this tool as it should be. But what I can assure you is that everybody knows that we are rooted and hooked into the QCPR, and we see it as a tool that can continuously evolve to ensure that it's not one that we play lip service to, but is a critical part of the toolkit that we have. In many ways, I think that thanks to your determination, we've even got our capitals involved in the QCPR. I know from many developing countries that this is the first time that they've actually asked, you know, so what does this mean and how does this entail? So we've been able to join the dots of a generally well thought of a process that happens in New York to its implications and its results on the ground. And I think that actually is because one of the things that member states asked for when you gave us the resolution was that you accompany us and we understand what that means on a regular basis, the reform process itself. Our RCs and UN country teams take guidance from the QCPR, and I think that this helps them to keep a focus on the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. The resolution 72279 has reinforced the QCPR from 2016. This is a major achievement. It's a huge reform package. It's not always that you find a Secretary General coming in for the first time, picking up three, as I said, main pieces of reform: management, peace and security, and then development, and to reinforce development, to pick up issues around gender, which have been incredibly important to our ambition as well. The creation of a new function to coordinate sustainable development is a breakthrough and changes the game in our road towards 2030, and the early effects of reforms have been visible in the response to COVID. And the example for that is, quite frankly, the work between the RC, the WHO, and the country team in record time coming back with preparedness plans. 94% in every one of our countries is a testament to the reality of these reforms and them taking root. Share with you, I'm just coming now from the launch of the vaccine initiative, which is led by WHO, which is supported by the system, by industry, by many in research, and leaders. The lineup of leaders today that launched this initiative shows that there very much is a belief that the system can carry this. And what is it coordinating? It's coordinating a partnership that will develop, produce, and deliver to citizens a global public good, a COVID vaccine, in half the time, 6 to 12 months around the world. And I think that that's remarkable. And it could not have been done a few years ago. We would have had many more tensions in trying to get even ourselves together. The key reform areas that we have, I think it's worth going through a few of these issues. They'll be detailed with DESA, DCO, and EOSG later. But I would say the successful establishment of the new resident coordinator system. I think at the beginning of 2019, everybody thought that this just may be a Y2K moment where people would fall off the cliff. It was nerve-wracking, December to January, and everybody asking for results before we'd even begun to trek that road. But it has been stood up. Support and effort. Again, the interactions between the different constituencies should not be underestimated, in a way in which the relationship between our agencies, member states, the boards, capitals, I mean, all of these players were around pushing for us to make sure we maintained the ambition of the resolution. So that establishment for us is a credit to that collaboration. The new generation of country teams being rolled out of the redesigned UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework at the heart of these efforts. Again, pushback on a cooperation framework that shouldn't have been so, but it was changing the game. It was putting countries at the center and priorities of countries in the center of what we were doing, and not our mandates. Our mandates are supposed to serve countries' interests and their priorities for their people. But what we found was that the mandate was running ahead of those priorities, and we would justify it. And I think that was a big change, because we also reinforced the centrality of having a robust common country assessment. The new Development Coordination Office that has been set up, of course, it built on what was already there in DOCO, but we realized that we had to deepen and broaden what we would need to do to support 131 RCs. Why? Because in the separation, a lot of the capacity that came with UNDP disappeared in terms of the backstopping. And we had to fill that gap really quickly for an agenda that was bigger than the MDGs. Remember that this system that was together was together to support the MDGs. We were separating it to support an even bigger agenda, conceptually and otherwise. And I think here the success in doing that has been largely because we've been able to set up the Development Coordination Office, and in particular say that the regions have specificities that need to be taken care of. And so having regional DCOs go to the field and not sit in New York has been incredibly helpful in making sure that we are connected with the realities of the challenges of very many cross-border issues. And then it has encouraged the learning and the collaboration of the peers in terms of our RCs, not just across countries, but even across regions. The funding compact, very difficult to get. But again, thank you for staying the course there, and it has started to bear fruit. We can always refer to it when things seem to be slipping, and that's really important because it was a well thought through process which experts actually went through on a day-to-day basis. You pushed and pushed and pushed and made sure that we interrogated everything we did. So it's a robust mechanism for helping us to make sure that we are being less fragmented and more accountable for resources. We are building synergies across the humanitarian and development action in crisis and emergency settings through the work of the Joint Steering Committee to advance humanitarian and development cooperation. And that was not easy. Again, how did we make that sure that that consolidated itself to the realities on the ground? Was again to take the layers out so that we were nearer to responding to country teams' requests rather than assuming what they would be, because we had a number of perhaps global and less so regional analysis. The Joint Steering Committee has targeted a few countries to bring some specificity to the work that we are doing, and we hope that we can share with you some of the issues that we've been quite successful at, but also some of the challenges going forward. I think that the reforms have also reasserted the role of member states through the GA and ECOSOC in giving coherent guidance to the system. Before these reforms, there was a disproportionate focus on individual agency boards, making the system-wide effort quite elusive. And member states now have the tools to fully exercise their oversight. And really the RC system connects the GA and ECOSOC, seeing the guidance that you have for results on the ground. But I also say that I was privileged to attend the boards as they came together for that town hall the other day, albeit virtually. But what was exciting about that is that each of the boards was talking about the whole of the agenda and not the specificity of their each purpose of their boards, and tasking a group of leaders of the UN system to talk across their responsibilities, because in the end, what you want to get is an outcome that is an integrated response to the 2030 agenda. In the road ahead, we really have to build on the momentum. We have, I think, not to make perfect the enemy of the good. A lot of what we have seen in terms of the success is implementing it. And as we implement it, we are, I think, humble and honest enough to say some things have not worked. And we've had to come back and really address those and troubleshoot them to see how they've been very, constructive and robust discussions. And I think we are going to need that going forward. I look forward very much to the review next year, because I think there are many lessons learned for trying to, again, respond to a post-COVID world, but also take what we should scale up and fast track, because it's actually gaining results on the ground. Some of the things I think that we will need to complete, and I hope to have your support with all of this, the unfinished business of the current QCPR. Sorry, I thought I was talking for too long. Making the cycle a model of compliance. We have key mandates that are still pending. And let me say here that I think with hindsight, which is 2020 vision, I think it's a good thing we push these two elements forward, because we've had really constructive discussions around how to make the regional reform package complete, and give the MCO review the credit and the time that it deserved. And I think in both of these, the system has learned that you cannot fast track a discussion where people want to understand, if you are going to make changes or offer investments in a particular system like the multi-country offices, walk people through what the results will be and how you will get them. And I think that people just assumed through commitment and goodwill that was enough for member states. Of course it's not enough, because that's not something you can go and explain at capital or within the communities that we deal with. So I hope that with these two we can proceed swiftly. In ECOSOC, we're waiting feedback on the system-wide strategic document from you, and the SG is taking forward his commitment to strengthen the system-wide evaluations to try to firewall and make it independent, so that you're able to see in fact, if we are getting these things right. These 4 remaining pieces are mandates that remain under implementation before this QCPR cycle closes. There is a transition, so it's not as though we fall off a cliff and we stop. I think having the nod from our member states so that we can actually, you know, as they say, move ahead on all of these 4 very quickly is important. The second is that we must ensure transformational QCPR in the fall. I was asked a few months ago, you know, what we expected of it, and I really wanted to see how a member states, experts thinking about the next QCPR, guidance to the UN development system on how it should work, but also the kind of integrated policy guidance and technical support that we need to give countries. And I think we can give you quite a bit of feedback from what has happened in just trying to get our common country analysis, in just trying to get the discussions going when you asked us to look at the regions, region by region specificity, and the birth of these issue-based coalitions, and really robust discussions about what integration means beyond the word, getting off the paper into that interaction that happens at the country. So I hope that the next QCPR will reflect the shift from the architecture and processes of the reform to the strategic and policy guidance on how member states will leverage a stronger UNDS in this transformative agenda. We do need another historic QCPR, and I think that, you know, maybe that word historic would not have been as weighty as it is today had we not had COVID. So some reflection as to what the world looks like after this will also help us in the next 4 years. It would also help us to, I think, impress again the importance of the decade. We will be revising our view of how we ought to move the decade in this new norm. It's still as relevant as is climate change. All the issues that you put on the table will not go away, but we have to find other ways of putting them forward and getting the traction that we need to countries. And remembering that in countries now, as we lock down, particularly in the constituencies where we have to do most of the lifting of the challenges of 2030 agenda, you know, we're going to be working not in the connected space that we had, not in the communities, but in this virtual reality, which makes it so much more difficult and incredibly stressful for many people on the ground. We're waiting for COVID to land. I hope when it makes landfall in our developing countries, certainly the preparedness there for health is there, but is it there for development? Because development needs the resources that we have been fighting for in the last 6 weeks, for debt, asking for debt standstills, asking for stimulus packages and fiscal space to be created. I think, you know, our RCs and the UN country teams are going to be greatly challenged. What is needed from you, our experts? I mean, I think everyone has to recognize your role in the ambition of a negotiation, or a negotiation that doesn't happen. I think that, you know, you have great responsibility for that ambition, or for if it doesn't work. And I don't like to use the word failure, because I think sometimes that is harsher than the commitment and the intention of the negotiations. But you are the lifeblood of multilateralism. And one of the things I hope you will challenge us to is that we are asking and we are saying to the world that we can only go further together, and that multilateralism matters even more today in our globalized world. Yet, are we doing that from the inside out? Are we doing that as a system? Are we doing that as member states on the floor, in our committees? Are we banding together to get the results that we need, so that we reflect to the outside, this is how you do it, this is what it looks like. It's tough, and it requires expertise, it requires a great deal of commitment and thought to find the solutions to get the results that we need. This has to change, and I can say that clearly in the system. You need to message that to us, because if that's not messaged from you, then what we will say is that we haven't seen the message, and we use the excuse not to come together to think about how we work in an integrated way. So the signals of the way you work will affect the way the system works. So there's a responsibility that is demanded of you, and I think that you're all up to it. I think when I look around and the experts that I've had the privilege of having conversations with, this is not beyond you at all. You have lots to do. What I have appreciated in our member states and the missions that you have is that there are many member states that don't have the same capacities. So when we talk about sometimes inequality, I say, well, you know, one member state has probably got 50 people on a particular issue between New York and Capital, and then there are some member states that have got 3 people here and no one listening at home. And that's, you know, then that gives a sense of, you know, it's even more important, the frameworks that we have, that we work together to achieve the results. It's the QCPR 2016 and the GA resolution, evidence that we can get consensual resolutions that don't resort to the lowest common denominator. I think you put paid to that, you demystified that one. Everybody looks at the 2030 agenda and wonders how we got it. I think if we had to negotiate it today, it would be very, very difficult. So we have to protect what we have. And we count on you to continue the charge ahead with that same determination, hold us accountable, ask the questions. I think if our lives are not made uncomfortable, then we are in no way understanding the real temperature in countries and in regions where the reality is stark. We count on every expert to take the same spirit to the OAS in May, and ensure that we cross the finishing line of the unfinished business of QCPR. I think that you can take credit that these are good pieces of work. And if we can get that across the line, fantastic. But I'm more excited about the next one. How are we going to co-create the next one? What are we going to set in terms of ambitions? 4 years, maybe short, but it's a long time when we start talking about step-by-step implementing the 2030 agenda. So I hope that, you know, that the next QCPR will help accelerate our efforts at the ground. Later today, we'll be launching advanced versions of the SG's report on the QCPR and my report on DCO. We trust this will provide you with extensive data, evidence, and analysis to continue to give us direction and hold us accountable. We've tried to stay faithful to the expectations of what an institution must produce, a bureaucracy must provide, and I think DESA has helped us to do that. But we've also tried to lift it so it is lighter to read, it's easier to digest, it allows you to come back at us with you know, constructive engagements that help us to move towards the transformative journey that we have laid out for people and for our environment. I'll finish just on the COVID response. It's the first time that we have generated a sense of emergency about development. That's a really big change, because when you address development, you address it with a time frame of 15 years. Now it's 10 years. But to address development in the space of weeks and months is not something that we are all used to. And I saw that as we tried to create the framework to operationalize the SG's report on the socioeconomic impact of COVID. COVID came, health emergency. The prescription we gave to suppress the virus now has side effects that could cause another pandemic on the socioeconomic side. Removing people from the economy, formal or informal, has the same results. You have people who cannot make a living, whether it is a paycheck at the end of the month or it is that daily income that our informal sector, mostly women and the very vulnerable, have to live with. And we have come back with a creative way of saying to the world, we have to do both. We have to look at people's health and we have to look at their livelihood. And both of these can be existential threats to the human. And the human endeavor and spirit to survive is huge. So this can cause a lot of unrest. This can cause much more trouble for the health pandemic than we would have expected. And so when you see we launched the framework on Monday for trying to help countries integrate health, humanitarian, and the socioeconomic, you know, bear with us, accompany us, try to explain to capitals, it's not a choice between any one of the three. We have to do all three. Just as we say to everyone, you might prioritize the Sustainable Development Goals, but in the end, you've got to do the lot. But in the response to COVID, If we do not do the three, we will not find ourselves on the other side of COVID in a stronger way. And we do want to build back better. We want to profit from this crisis in opportunities to strengthen and accelerate the decade of action to have the SDGs. Let me stop there, and thank you so much for taking the patience to listen to me.
Thank you very much, Deputy Secretary General, for such an inspiring presentation. At a certain moment, you said that you were afraid that you were speaking too long. I am 100% sure that our almost 150 participants in this video conference were delighted to listen to you because of the motivation and for the tact of how to proceed from now on. And I fully agree on the latest statement about the COVID situation. And we have been tracking the question of participants. I don't know how much time do you have to stay with us, but most of them, if I have to summarize them, are related to the COVID and how much, what is the impact of COVID will have and the operational activities for development, and what is beyond COVID. But you mostly address that issue at your related point. So we have to cross the pond to continue with our panel, but I will not closing without asking you if you have at least 1 minute to tackle this issue in order just to satisfy this question. It seems to me that delegates are very concerned about really of the COVID at the own national level and the regional level, and the impact that it may have in the response that the United Nations can do. We have a panel with several speakers online. If you can really kindly briefly tell us something about that, I'll really appreciate. And then kindly also appreciate the time of Ambassador Luber for introducing you and for being with us today and for the support he has given to us. A final word, Madam Deputy Secretary General?
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure how much time I have, but I would have liked to have stayed a little bit longer just to hear from you. But, you know, I think on the health preparedness, countries are going to find that already our country teams and governments are finding ways and means of managing domestic resources, sorting out supply chains on the medical side, looking to see how they can help economically, stimulus packages that try to keep jobs, but at the same time are already now looking at how to scale up social protection programs, cash transfers, ensuring that the services that, you know, are in the health services that go on before COVID must continue. Women must try, we must try to make sure that women are giving birth safely. We must also deal with vaccine campaigns and commodities that people need, as well as everything else. And so this is something that is going on, and the feedback that we get every day, each country gives us feedback on how that is going, and if they have challenges, we try to troubleshoot that with the task force that we have on the supply chains, or one that is dealing with the specificities of a country team and the support that it needs with our business continuity plan. Or, as you saw when we went to the spring meetings, we convene with ministers to find a consensus around a call that they would like to make ministers of finance, for instance, on the debt standstill. We're involved in supporting them there. I think what the preparation for, as I say, sort of the landfall for COVID in our developing countries is quite complex, because you're suddenly finding that governments are challenged with a political situation where there is a lockdown to try to suppress the transmission. There are not enough testing kits, so you can't even test to trace to begin to think about that if you're thinking just about what you would do here to take to the south. What complicates things with populations, the densities of those populations, the slums, the lack of infrastructure on water and sanitation. So this is where I say, to an extent, there's a bit of opportunity here, because we can say in a stimulus package, we need to see a line item extending the water and sanitation facilities into slums, because that alone will help us to contain the spread of the virus. No longer just a list of priorities of we'll get to putting water and sanitation in that slum when the next election comes, but now if we don't do it, COVID is going to come into towns, it's going to spread everywhere. The social unrest is because in a lockdown, as I said, the informal, I mean, you can see it from all over Africa, you see it in Central, in Southeast Asia, where people are not understanding why they have to give up the chance of a meal, and that means hunger, to the lockdown because of COVID, and they can't see it. So a lot of what we're also trying to do with governments are the communication, the advocacy, and to find a way not to be either or. And so you'll see some countries locking down, in particular, population centers of certain urban centers, capitals, and then slowly rolling out the lockdown. It's never going to be perfect. I mean, I think the humanitarian sector is going to have to deal with the issue of IDPs very, very quickly, because in a country where you don't have the response to densely populated areas, people are going to leave. And just as we say that countries bordering one another, that those borders are porous, and things go across like climate change and refugees and such, it's going to happen within a country as well. And that's what we're going to have to deal with. So there's a lot of planning in the country teams with the humanitarian actors that we partner with to try to see how we can protect existing IDP camps, refugee camps, and that in the eventuality of these large numbers of fatalities, how would we deal with them as we go forth? Each region, each country is different. We're right now trying to set up dashboards that feed in the information real time. We have them to plan with, but we'd like to have them to share with you. This is, I think, you know, member states here really want to know what is happening in their countries, and so we're hoping to do that. I responded, I hope that the response to the SIDS, for instance, when they were asking, so who's doing what, how, where, and when, where are the resources coming from and to? And thank you, our ambassador from Belize, who has pushed us for that. We now have something for you so that you can share with the SIDS, but I'd like that to be for all countries, so experts can have a look at that, and where there are gaps in information you need, you come back to us and you ask, and you hopefully get a response. It is a work in progress. I think, you know, we have to manage expectations. This is not finishing this year. So we're repurposing our resources to be more COVID responsive. We're also repurposing our work plans, because much of what we thought we could do, we're not going to be able to do. But we're trying to ask people to look at the framework on the socioeconomic. There are things that we can do much quicker than we would have done before. Education online, cash transfers, identifications, because IDs now will become necessary if we want to try to get to people quickly. Infrastructure, like water and sanitation. So there is a silver lining on this crisis. It has a human face, but there's a silver lining.
Thank you very much, Deputy Secretary, for your extended presentation. Of course, we would like to have even more time to be with you. The QCPR preparation for this year is 5 modules. We will more than happy to have you once again. We will coordinate with your office. Unfortunately, for today, we have to move on, and we have panelists from Europe also. Professor Peter Meselli will be with us. So Ambassador Luber, Deputy Secretary General, thank you very much for your kind time and for engaging in a conversation with our participants.
Thank you. Could you just make sure that I receive feedback, because I really would like to hear what the experts have said through all of this. Whoever is harvesting the rich outcomes of this conversation, I really would be interested in them. So, you know, grateful for you having me, but please let me hear what you all had to say at the end of the experience. Thank you very much, and be safe.
Thank you very much, you too. And the session has been recorded, and it will be put on the website of UNITAR. And also some of the questions that member state has put in out that we will not be able to cover today, we will be sent it. Maybe we can prepare a summary of them and send it to the member state that how they put it. There is many ways that we can read, but for sure you will get the feedback of this session for your consideration. And thank you very much for your time. We will move now to the second part. We are kindly to request Ambassador Neil Pierre from Guyana, our moderator for the panel, to take on and to introduce the panelists, lead the discussions, and also to address a little bit of the thematic. So Neil, if you are online, could you please take over? I'll appreciate that.
I am indeed online, Ambassador. Thank you very much. Ambassador Marco Suazo, for steering us through the first and very inspiring round of our training module today. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot help but note that we have in excess of 200 participants signed up. It really is a monumental task and a credit to technology and our own adaptability to work in new and often constraining circumstances, but we are resilient. I think we're off to a very good start. First, let me introduce myself, and then I will tell you how the rest of this morning's program will flow. My name is Neil Pierre. I am the G77 coordinator in the permanent mission of Guyana to the United Nations. As many of you would know, Guyana this year has the distinction of being in the chairmanship of the Group of 77 in China. And my job is, of course, to coordinate the positions of the group on all of these issues. With us this morning are a set of outstanding experts, professionals, and knowledgeable people who can speak to some of the issues that really are at the heart of what we're trying to achieve through this training exercise and in the preparation for the QCPR process. The session will be, the section of the training module will be divided into two sessions or two segments. We will have a first segment where we will hear from Professor Peter Messerly and from Ambassador Lois Young. And then we will move to the second segment of this section or session, where we will hear from Mr. Marcus Riesel, Marian Barthelemy, and Ms. Michelle Giles McDonough. A few housekeeping or rules. You've heard this before, but I will repeat them just so that if anyone joined late, you'll know how we will be managing the session. I will invite each of the first two speakers to make their presentations, and then we will move to a round of questions or interactive discussions, questions and answers, addressed to, in the first instance, both of the speakers. The same pattern will be followed when we come to the next round of presentations and discussions involving three colleagues. The way the technology works, many of you already know and are more adept at it than many of us, but just as a reminder, your screen has a feature for participants and a chat feature. You can use those features to pose a question in writing, and we will see it on the screen and actually present it to the speakers for response. I will also take questions in groups or blocks so that we won't have the panelists or presenters respond to each and every question as they come. The last thing to note in terms of the mechanics is that in addition to posting written questions, there is a feature that will allow you to raise your hands in Zoom, and that will tell us that you'd like to ask a question. Now, I just want to say that that might be a fairly limited option technologically, because I am not so sure that with over 200 people participating, how many of those we'll be able to give the microphone to in a practical way. Well, with those little preliminary ground rules out of the way, I'd like to really get us started with the focus on the substance of and reason for which we're here today. Let me first introduce Professor Peter Messerly to speak to us. Professor Messerly is the Professor for Sustainable Development at the University of Bern in Switzerland, and he's also the director of the Center for Development and Environment. Professor Maserli, if you're with us and you can hear me, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'll share some slides instantly, and I hope this works. I hope everybody can see that. Okay. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the kind invitation. And it's a huge privilege to be here to present to you some of the key insights of the UN Global Sustainable Development Report, which has the title, "The Future is Now, Science for Achieving Sustainable Development." This report was given as a mandate to a group of 15 scientists in 2016. They were appointed by the Secretary General, and the mandate was given by the member countries. And the member states basically, to simplify a little bit, asked 3 questions. They asked, if we pull together all those different reports about the status of development, what is the bigger picture that we get? The second question to science was, science is pretty good in announcing the problem and warning, but do we also have science for solving those problems, and what's the state of knowledge? And finally, the third topic was, how can we improve the interactions between science and policy at the level of the UN, and could we give recommendation also to member states? So I would like to report on these 3 questions a little bit today. And as you can see here, the image I have chosen for the very start, it is a balloon image, a balloon which probably went up pretty high. It's the NASA night lights of the Earth. But I think it summarizes some very pretty important features of our times. We see that humankind is controlling and dominating the planet and the nature to the very most remote corners of the world, and nature and people are almost inseparable whatever we do. We also know that these lights are powered to 80% by fossil fuels, on which relies also a lot of our human well-being. And we are supposed to change that and invert this ratio in the next 10 to 20 years, a huge challenge. And we also see many regions where there are not so many lights, but we all know a lot of people are living there. And it shows us incredible and growing inequalities across this planet. So for these challenges, I think the 2030 agenda is our compass, but the question is, how can we implement them, and what could be the contribution of knowledge in these things? So I would like to share today 3 short insights that we have come up with in this GSDR, and 3 conclusions and recommendations towards such knowledge-based transformations, as we call them. Our first insight, relates, I have to get the controls back. Okay. Our first insight relates to the overall status of development. And we are asking, under the business as usual scenarios, will we reach 2030 the different targets of the SDGs? And you can see here in different colors, the green colors, the brownish colors, and the red colors, how SDGs perform. And you can see in the green light that, for example, under 5 mortality is within a 5% reach by 2030, or the enrollment in primary education. Then we have a lot of targets which are off track, between 5 and over 10%. And we know, hunger is on the rise again. Poverty eradication is more challenging than we thought. But perhaps the most alarming thing are the red targets. The red targets actually show negative trends. It means we're not even on track. We are backtracking from our goals. And that can be, for example, the absolute material footprint. It can be the biodiversity, or it's also, as I said before, raising inequalities. So we clearly see we have to sound the alarm bell, and we know ordinary approaches will not take us to the fulfillment of the SDGs by 2030. So we need desperately to move from a linear approach to a more exponential approach. Or in today's language, you could say we need to bend the curve, but the other way, towards an exponential curve, if we really want to achieve the 2030 agenda. So what are the underlying main drivers and processes happening? And I would like to start with human well-being and choosing here very simple indicators for human well-being. Of course, the family size here on the x-axis and the children mortality on the y-axis. And you know this pattern where we can say there is one pattern with small families, very few children that die, what we call developed world, and the developing world with many big families and a lot of children die. I'm sure you are aware of that, but I hope this is not your image of today's world, because this was in 1967 and it's not true anymore. If we move to the current state of 2017, this pattern has disappeared and we have seen an incredible progress, all these families moving into small families with very few children that die. And we have today a prosperity which has never been before than today, the 24th of April, probably. But you see, there is a question mark behind this question of success story. What are the downsides? What are the challenges? And I would just like to pick some very few. For example, the issue of biodiversity. We are just starting to realize the urgency of a massive extinction coming. We have just seen recently a study that Germany has lost 30% of its insects within 10 years, and we don't even know what this means for food production, for health, and many other things. Then, of course, we have here on the right side the inequalities. The information from the World Bank tells us that inequality between countries has actually gone down, and this is a success. But within country, it is on the rise. So this is not good news. It basically means that the elites here in Bern, in Geneva, in New York, or Delhi, or Johannesburg are more and more becoming the same, whereas those people who are more and more marginalized are really out of the overall development. And we know today that absolute poverty cannot be alleviated anymore by economic growth. That's what the World Bank is telling us. No model of trickle down will work to reach those farthest behind. And of course, in the lower part, you see climate change. I will not explain it to you in detail, but just remember ourselves of this hockey stick curve, which sees a very stark increase, and it points to the urgency of change. It's our decision where pathway we will go. And related to this increase in temperature are these tipping elements, whatever it is, from the Greenland ice to the Amazonas. And mind you that in the consecutive IPCC reports, this risk landscapes has increasingly corrected to lower levels. So the risks are imminent, and we see some of these tipping points are already underway. So stepping back and seeing the links between those different elements, I tell myself 10 years ago, science has announced that there will be a pandemic, and it has come. And when we look at this picture, we can say science is announcing a series of other crises, and it has also a horizon of 10 to 20 years. So it's not so much different in terms of the time spans we're talking about. And I'm very happy that these messages have arrived into politics. And for me, it has been almost a historical moment in Davos early this year, where the Secretary General made the following announcement.
I know that for some people there is this idea, well, climate change is probably something to take into account in the future, and the planet is very resilient, and the planet will not be destroyed. I fully agree. The planet will not be destroyed. In the next few centuries and millennia, we will see the planet around the sun. What will be destroyed is our capacity to live in this planet. We will be destroyed by climate change, not the planet.
Okay, with this statement, I think we see the urgency, but of course the question is, how do we go about it? What are the means to accelerate change towards the 2030 agenda? So I would like to share now these 3 insights with you. And the first insight is about the SDGs. And we asked basically, when we look at the current state of knowledge, over 65 UN flagship reports, a lot of scientific reports, we asked, what do they tell us about the SDGs and especially their interaction? Here you can see a matrix where all this knowledge has been mapped onto this matrix in terms of interactions. And the blue colors tell you that these are co-benefits or synergies, that if I do one thing for an SDG, it will go in the same direction for the other SDGs. But in red, you see trade-offs, that something might an initiative on one SDG might block the other one. So to make a very simple example, if we take SDG 2 and we achieve SDG 2, we know we will do a lot of good things. We will take people out of poverty. We give them a better health, and the economy will be supported, etc. But we also have to be aware, if we scale up the current food systems, we will create 90% more greenhouse gas emissions, and we will consume about 50% more of the land. So you see these conflicts and these synergies, and vice versa. The destiny of SDG 2 will depend on a lot of factors which define them. If we step back from that, it becomes very clear the SDG is an undivisible agenda in its very proper sense. And when we address one SDG alone, we probably do it a disservice because we are overseeing the unintended effects. And for me, the key to acceleration really lies in these interactions. If we can address those trade-offs and overcome them in order to really mobilize the synergies and co-benefits, that's when we move from vicious to virtuous circles, and that's when we can bend the curve upwards. So that is perhaps the key message from this. And if we take a conclusion for our work, our conclusion that we propose from the GSDR is to say we have to move away from goals and problems towards the causes that are behind them. And these causes are inherently in the key systems of our world. That's how our economies are producing goods and how we are consuming them. It's the energy decarbonization and access. It's the food system, which is currently dysfunctional with half of the population eating too much or not enough. And of course, it's the urban and semi-urban development in our world. And accompanying these four key systems, we also need to address human well-being and capabilities, and we need to address global environmental commons, not only because it's urgent, but it's also that we can build a resilient world for the next 10 years. It's going to be quite a bumpy way. So this is our key message: move from the SDG agenda through the interactions to those key systems on which our transformations should work. But the question is, how do we transform them? What are the levers for change? And I would move with this to our next insight I would like to share. And you see here a graphic of flows of information across the world, of flows of goods, of capital and people. And since the 60s, all those indicators, whatever it is, have shown exponential growth. The world is not the same anymore as it was in Brundtland time, and it's not the same anymore as we had it even in MDG times. It's a hyper-connected world, and we are, of course, seeing a testimony these days with the current crisis. But perhaps more importantly, what we have to understand in such a world, we can export our problems to other territories and our CO2 emissions or our inequalities. And at the same time, we become dependent, of course, from how other countries manage the world. So from this, I would like to take two conclusions. The first is obvious. The public sector will not be able to change the world. It will have to work with these forces of globalization, be it technology, be it economy, being global civil societies. That's one thing. And the second thing is, of course, and it has been said before, public authorities which are confined to national territories will not be able to control and regulate the mass of flows which are going across the world. So for us, the second conclusion of our report is, if we want to really address those transformations and bring change, we can basically work with four levers: governance, economy and finance, it's civil society through our individual and collective action, and of course, science and technology. Now you may say that's totally trivial. Yes, it's probably trivial, but I think it's very important to say and to distinguish what is the means and what is the end. If transformation is the end, then governance and economy and science is a means. And this we have to understand. The second important point, and we have seen it, none of these levers will be able to do it alone. We cannot wait in those silos for the silver bullet solution that will do the trick. We need to connect urgently, and that's perhaps the bottom line. We need innovations. how these levers can be combined, how we can work together. And we have to radically rethink the partnership between the public sector and the economy, between the economy and civil society, and so on. With this, I would like to move to the third and last insight I would like to share. And this comes from the regional consultation we have been doing through our report in every continent, in small island states, and so on. And this graph is quite a simple graph. On the x-axis, you see how many biophysical so it shows all the countries and how many biophysical boundaries have been transgressed. So how much is the contribution to the environmental crisis from left to right? And on the y-axis, you see the social thresholds achieved. So how much human well-being have you achieved? I think it becomes clear the overall vision of the 2030 agenda is in the upper left corner, where we achieve a lot of human well-being with a small environmental footprint. It means we need to reconfigure basically the relationship between men and people and nature. But for me, the first key insight from that is that the distance to target is exactly the same if we live in Switzerland or if we live in Cambodia. The path we have to go is as far as exactly the same. Second point, of course, the starting point matters. Each country has a different challenges, but it also has different priorities. So these pathways towards the upper left corner are different. And there is not one recipe from one country that can feed the other one alone. That's the second one. And the third insight is, and I put up this green flash arrow here, it must be in the interest of all countries that the countries on the lower left end don't follow the green path. So to grow first and clean up later cannot be an option. And it must be in the interest also of these developed countries that every country starts its pathway to the left corner with the innovation needed, with the knowledge that is there. Good. And I would like to perhaps come to the last conclusion. So the combination of these levers for these transformation effects must happen in the local context. It must be responding to the needs. And that's what from our report we call the pathways to sustainable development that we need to design. Pathways which are context specific, but which respond to the overall and universal challenges that we have. And so for those of you who don't have the time to read our 130 pages report, here is perhaps so how you can talk about it. So our report basically looks at these different systems at each of these entry points. We talk about the impediments, we talk about the levers, what we know about them, and then illustrate some integrated and context-specific pathways. And we conclude with a call to action to governments, to UN agencies, but also, of course, to the private sector and civil society. And I would like to illustrate that shortly. So if, for example, we talk about the food systems and we have a vision of a sustainable food system and nutrition patterns, which I would like to illustrate with this wonderful picture from China here, then the report can offer knowledge about levers. We know that we need to start governing the value and supply chains in the governments. We need market access, and insurance policies are solutions we know about. Food waste is a key lever. There is a lot of knowledge about how to change things. But as I said before, this is general knowledge, and the combination needs to be locally. And this I would like to illustrate with a story here from Nigeria, where many farmers have been bringing their food to the city, but due to volatility of market prices, a lot of their produce has been rotten, has been lost, and they have been losing a lot of money. So these women here have put themselves together in a group. They used solar technology to provide those cold hubs, and they have been renting space to farmers to cool and store their produce, and they have been making money, and a lot of product has been saved. And if we reflect that on the image we had before, this is for me typical, a good example how these levers have been combined. Protection, legislation, then market access, health has been in there, and the success is huge. And that's where I see this multiplication effect, where we multiply one factor by the other when we have accelerated action towards the SDGs. I'm almost done, but of course, as a scientist, I cannot speak without talking also about science and the role of science. And please allow me 2 minutes on that. And this map
Yes,
from
Professor, 2 minutes.
Okay. And this map from UNESCO shows us the density of researchers per million people around the world. And you see that in the Western world, you have about 3,500 researchers, where in least developed countries, about 70. So the city of Geneva would have about 50 researchers doing knowledge and so on. And this is not a question of equity only. If we remember ourselves, the innovation that is needed, the knowledge to design those pathways, then this is a huge challenge globally. And the second point is here, you see, where does the investment into R&D come from? And it's 60% coming from the private sector and 30% only from the public. And I must say, I'm not sure if any really country has enough science to address those global challenges we are talking about. With this, I would like to close and perhaps as a conclusion, just remind ourselves of the title, The Future is Now. I think the COVID crisis is like a magnifying glass showing us that the future is now, because it points to the very ultimate challenge that we probably have, is to overcome this growing gap between what we know and what we're actually doing. So from the GSDR, our recommendation is clear. We have to move from SDGs and goals to the key transformation of the systems that we need to happen in the next 10 years. We have to work with these levers. It demands radically new partnerships. And finally, we need to work locally with the people, combining these levers, responding to their needs, but keeping in mind those universal transformations. We need sustainable development to be very innovative, and we need to move from linear processes to multiplication to bend this curve towards exponential growth. So thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you very much, Professor Maselli. That was quite a lot of food for thought. And your presentation reminded me of Ambassador Lauber's invocation to us earlier this morning, when he talked about the balloon driver. I think you've given us a lot of the tools that will help us in the task of being the balloon drivers that we are supposed to be. And so I thank you. I would also just like to ask, with your permission, if it would be okay for us to distribute your presentation widely to all of the participants and maybe even upload it on the UNITAR website.
Absolutely. I have already shared it, I think, with UNITAR.
Yes, we have it.
Okay.
Thank you so very much. Towards the end of your presentation, you actually ended with words that said a call to action. And that actually allows us to segue very nicely into our next presentation. I'd like to introduce Her Excellency, Ambassador Lois Young, who is the permanent representative of Belize to the United Nations and the chairperson of the Alliance of Small Island Developing States, AOSIS. It's a bit trite when we say someone needs no introduction, because Ambassador Young has been around these halls of the United Nations for quite some time. But I think what is more important is for us to hear her perspectives today on the topic of the Decade of Action. How can the United Nations Development System best support the acceleration required to achieve the 2030 agenda? Ambassador Young, I'd like to give you the floor, and then I'd like to ask both presenters to stay connected for some questions, some of which have already been posed and others that we expect or anticipate. The floor is yours, Ambassador Young.
Thank you, Neil Pierre. Thank you, Jörg. And thank you, Marco.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. That's a stunning backdrop.
Yes.
So this is the backdrop that was used for the Placencia Ambition Forum that just finished on Wednesday, where we spoke about trying to keep the drumbeat of climate ambition alive. And we had a really very good forum, 7.5 million hits. This is the digital age. I mean, it's just open to the world. So there's a good thing and a bad thing with COVID. So that's one of the good things, I think. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this virtual training module. And as you said, Neil, I am to speak on how can the UN development system best support the acceleration that is needed, required to achieve the 2030 agenda? And I'll address that question from the vantage point of small island and low-lying coastal developing states of the AOSIS group. First of all, I wish to set the context. If this question were posed at the same time last year, it may have yielded a different response. But today we are grappling with the COVID pandemic and like all the uncertainty and immediate challenges that countries have to deal with as a result. Immediate challenges. But as Professor Mazzarelli said before, COVID has acted as a magnifying glass to our systemic failures and our inequalities. And it has told us that we have got to deal with the climate change crisis as soon as possible. I mean, we knew it before from the science. Secondly, I will speak to the SIDS vision, Small Island Developing States, our vision, which we presented in our launch event in February of 2020. And thirdly, I will address how within that context of our vision as chair of AOSIS, I would envision the steps that the UN development system can take to accelerate not only the 2030 agenda, but also the Samoa pathway, which is the blueprint of SIDS for our sustainable development. So to deal with context, for AOSIS, with or without COVID-19, 2020 is a crucial year. But because of the virus, it has taken on even greater meaning as a turning point for multilateralism. 2020 marks the start of a decade within which we have time-bound obligations to meet in relation to sustainable development. We have the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We have Oceans, Goal 14, Goal 14 and the Decade of Ocean Science 2021 to 2030, and climate change, the IPCC 1.5 degree special report that everyone should know of by now, that says we have at the most 10 years to, I'll use the COVID language, bend the curve of climate change. Because the trajectory as we now stand is on a path to 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The 3 agendas, these are the 3 agendas, the Sustainable Development Agenda, Oceans, and Climate Change. Those are the 3 agendas that AOSIS has consistently championed. There are different levels of action that are envisioned for each of these agendas at the national, the regional, and the international level. Several international meetings were planned with the aim of advancing specific issues related to them, to the agendas, including the high-level political forum and the preparatory processes for the high-level political forum. The Ocean Conference in Portugal, which was to be in June of 2020, had to be postponed, and the intersessional climate change negotiations in Bonn in June of 2020 as usual. And then that leads us into the climate change conference itself, COP26, which has now been postponed until 2021. I'm not sure what date the United Kingdom will agree on with all stakeholders. We'll see. So colleagues, the global metastatic spread of COVID-19 has put those meetings on hold, and some are delayed indefinitely, maybe never to happen. The Central Forum for Decision-Making, the United Nations, we're on lockdown. I just saw the notice that came where the Secretary General says we're on lockdown until the end of May. So this COVID world in which we now exist presents a challenge for the way in which we conduct our multilateral diplomacy and advance the multilateral agenda. At the same time, the virus world elevates the importance of multilateralism. Our collective vulnerability to the pandemic from a health and economic perspective can't be addressed in a disjointed, piecemeal fashion. Collective action is fundamental, and the only forum with the legitimacy to guide that collective action is the United Nations. This is the only forum. The imprimatur of the United Nations on pathways is critical. Decisions, everything. This is the only forum with that legitimacy. The question that we have to address is, what does that collective action entail? And I propose that the commitments we agreed to in the various multilateral agendas remain relevant. We went through the process of negotiating them. They are still relevant. What has changed, however, is the approach we must now take to deal with an immediate emergency and still keep sight of those commitments. The AOSIS's vision, so that's the context. Now the AOSIS's vision. The AOSIS members are stalwart defenders of multilateralism. We have been actively engaged in bringing the world's attention to the pressing environmental issues of our time for like 30 years. It was the small island leaders like Dr. Arvid Pardo, the UN ambassador from Malta, known as the father of the law of the sea, who brought the world's attention to the need for a comprehensive legal framework to address the governance of our oceans as the common heritage of mankind. And now small island developing states continue to advocate for improving that framework in relation to areas beyond national jurisdiction. It was also the small island leaders who took up the charge of climate change and advocated for a framework convention to guide the global response to climate change. SIDS continue to advocate for climate action, setting the standard for global ambition. And I have to say, SIDS lead. SIDS lead in this respect. We are on the front lines of climate change. We cannot pick up our countries and move them elsewhere. We can have Rolls-Royce systems in place to combat hurricanes and cyclones. It doesn't matter when you have a cyclone or a hurricane of magnitudes 5 and beyond the scale, going off the scale of what they are measured by. It was also the small island leaders who advanced the concept of the integrated nature of the social, economic, and environmental pillars of sustainable development. Small islands were the first to conclude a sustainable development agenda in 1994 at the Barbados Program of Action, and actively engaged in the elaboration of the 2030 agenda, contributing specifically in that agenda to the elaboration of the climate and the ocean goals. Each of these issues represented immediate threats to SIDS, but these states also saw them as threats to the world, hence the need for a multilateral approach. I would like to put on record that it is not by chance that we advocated for a global response to oceans, climate, or sustainable development. We advocated for them as responsible global leaders and members of this community. As AOSIS, we do not hesitate to shoulder that responsibility. I will now share the vision we have set for 2020. 2020 marks a new phase in the implementation of the Samoa Pathway, which is the blueprint for the sustainable development of SIDS. And we are building out of that pathway and building on the successful outcome of the high-level midterm review. We had a midterm review in 2019, and we set a path for the next 5 years based on the Samoa Pathway. A top priority coming out of our review is securing access to low-cost and sustainable financing. And hey, COVID-19 makes that case stronger now. COVID has laid bare all of these inadequacies in the system. With our economies cut off from international markets for trade and finance, we are effectively surviving on minimal means to shore up our enfeebled healthcare systems and social safety nets, while also preparing for the next climate impact. Our friends in the Pacific had no time before Cyclone Harold struck them. Caribbean is going to start the hurricane season on the 1st of June. And the forecast is that it is going to be an active season. This COVID, we have no money coming in. The public coffers are dry. So contingent to that access to low cost and sustainable financing is a matter of changing the metrics. Even today, when a tiny island loses 200% of its GDP to a hurricane, an international financial institution will take out its GDP per capita formula, whip it out, to prescribe the terms of access. Nothing about vulnerabilities. And it is only by expending our own limited diplomatic capital that we can eke out a temporary relief. And I'm saying this absolutely honestly, trying to unlock a little bit here and a little bit there to get ourselves over the hurdle. It's a Sisyphean task. Every time we make an advance, we are rolled back by a disaster. When science all but dictates that our small islands will be suffering impacts of existential proportions more frequently, even in the best case temperature scenarios, it is a dereliction of duty for every international financial institution that should be working to avert financial crises to have this willy-nilly approach to small island developing states. A third access-related priority is to continue to advocate for systemic change. It is time for the financial ecosystem to internalize the special case of SIDS. It has been 30 years and we don't have another 30 years. As I said before, we cannot pick up our countries and move them elsewhere. Now, climate change. Unabated climate change is beginning to ring like a death knell for our island people. 2020 is the deadline for nations to make their climate plans consistent with achieving a 1.5 degree goal. That was a decision of the COP, Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC Treaty, 2020. AOSIS is working assiduously to raise the climate ambition. Climate ambition, we need to have better NDCs, better commitments to reducing global warming. We cannot continue to have emissions just spiraling on and on in the interest of development without regard to what it is doing to the environment. We are advocating for support to our own members as they elaborate their new plans. So we as members of SIDS have our new NDCs and we have been advocating, we have to prepare them and get them out. But we all know that our mitigation potential is negligible. So, you know, we are responsible for maybe like a 0.00 fraction of global emissions, negligible. So AOSIS is also pressing for the major emitters to increase their commitments in order to reduce their emissions. This, colleagues, is the only way to safeguard the goals of the Paris Agreement. It is not that we have to invent anything new. We went through and we negotiated the Paris Agreement in 2015. Let us follow the Paris Agreement. Let us implement that. That is all we're asking. To this end, to try and raise ambition, AOSIS convened, as I told you at the beginning, the Placencia Ambition Forum, a virtual, multi-regional, inclusive dialogue which drove home with the single objective of keeping the drumbeat of ambition alive. It is the key. It served as a knowledge-sharing platform for countries to learn from each other's experience, for institutions to elaborate how they can support ambition, and for civil society, private sector, local communities, and indigenous peoples to impact their knowledge and their own contribution to ambition. And as I said, it was a tremendous success, and you can go on the website and see it for yourself, www.aosis.org. While our focus is heightened on the climate ambition, we also are working to ensure, and this goes hand in hand, that the rules and institutions that support the implementation of the Paris Agreement are robust and strengthening. Our climate team is therefore working to finalize rules and guidance on markets, completing the technical work on reporting tables for the transparency framework, and putting forward options on how we can collectively define a finance agenda befitting of the ambition we want and need. Oceans. Finally, our vision for 2020 will reinforce advocacy for improved ambition governance of the high seas and to support the conservation and sustainable use of our ocean and its resources. We will continue to push for progress on matters relating to marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction and progress on implementation of SDG 14 on oceans. We will also continue to stand firm with science and wholly welcome the Decade of Ocean Science 2021 to 2030. And if you want to hear a very good statement on the issue of biodiversity, tune in to the AOSIS website and listen to the speech by the UN Ambassador of Fiji, Ambassador Satyendra, at the Placencia Ambition Forum. It's worth reading. So ladies and gentlemen, the AOSIS 2020 vision and its underpinning priorities are still relevant, and they will still drive our agenda for action and ambition. What has changed is how we pursue that agenda given the new challenges that COVID creates. According to ECLAC's recently released report entitled Assessing the Effects of COVID-19 to Plan the Recovery, like 2 days ago it came out, the COVID-19 pandemic will herald the worst economic contraction in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean, with a projected minus 5.3% drop in activity this year. ECLAC said that to find a contraction of this magnitude would mean going back to the Great Depression in 1930, where there was a minus 5.0% drop, or 1914, when growth plummeted minus 4.9%. Our countries did not even exist as independent sovereign nations at that time. The magnitude of this economic fallout is really unprecedented. SIDS have all but issued an SOS to international financial institutions with weak debt positions, little to no fiscal space, high risk profiles, climate vulnerability. COVID makes the special case for SIDS glaringly obvious. The UN development system. Without compromising our ambitious vision set out above, AOSIS is calling for urgent injection of liquidity and reprieve from debt. We welcome the Secretary General's commitment to continue to advocate for debt relief, and he has been marvelous in supporting SIDS' agenda, including for middle-income countries, to enable SIDS to survive both the impacts of COVID and the growing threats of climate change. And I want to thank the Secretary General for all that he has said. He hasn't just said it, no, he's been saying it for a while, and he has been repeating it at COVID, and he repeated the same thing at the Placencia Ambition Forum. I wish to share with you the specific calls that AOSIS itself, the chair of AOSIS, has made to the IMF and the World Bank. As chair of AOSIS, the Prime Minister of Belize has petitioned those institutions to realize the following. 1, to establish a dedicated window for SIDS. 2, increase eligibility as part of the IDA crisis response window so we are able to access immediate support for health crises. The IDA is for low income. We want it expanded to include middle and high income countries, which make up part of the SIDS constituency. 3, we support the Fund and the World Bank for an immediate standstill on sovereign debt payments and significant debt relief for all our members. AOSIS supports the call made by the IMF and the World Bank to request official bilateral creditors to suspend debt payments from IDA countries that request forbearance. As I said, IDA is low income, but we think that that does not go far enough, and it should include middle and upper income SIDS. 4, provide allocation to all members of the IMF to the general special drawing rights in line with what was provided in 2009 during the global financial crisis. So the United Nations Development System can help us press this case forward. Second, in its numerous noteworthy initiatives to support countries with recovery from COVID, it will be essential that the United Nations, especially through its United Nations Development System, maintains particular focus on the SIDS and ensure that its support for SIDS is guided by the Samoa Pathway, the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, and other relevant international commitments. SIDS readily acknowledge the important role of the UN development system in supporting our countries to pursue implementation of development commitments. We will continue to support the repositioning of the United Nations development system to improve its agility and flexibility, thus enabling it to be more responsive to our needs, which are many and are in a constant state of flux. In this context, I recall the review of the multi-country offices and the Secretary General's recommendations, which included the establishment of a new office in the North Pacific. It will be important that the affected countries be kept abreast on how these recommendations will be implemented in the current context, because they're still relevant and important. Colleagues, these are not easy times. Well before the pandemic, it was already evident that countries were not in a position to meet the lofty sustainable goals of the 2030 Agenda. We knew already that without a leap in effort and support, the Sustainable Development Goals would suffer the same fate as the MDGs. Our efforts now must be doubled. Let us not shy away from taking the bold steps that are needed to allow our countries to recover, and to do so by putting in place measures that will place us in a better stead to fully pursue our vision of the future we want. And I want to say thank you to the UN system for helping us. As I said, the imprimatur of the UN on any efforts is critical. Thank you very much, Neil. Thank you, colleagues, for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for a very comprehensive presentation that took us through the context, to the actions taken by SIDS leadership historically, and also to the vision and how you see the connections with the Decade of Action. Colleagues, we're running short of time, ladies and gentlemen, but I did say that we will allocate some time for some brief questions to both our presenters, Professor Maserli and Ambassador Young. I believe we have one or a couple of questions already posted, so let me read them. I think the first one is to Professor Maserli. Professor Maserli, do you want me to read the question or do you have it on your screen?
I do have it on my screen.
All right.
The second one as well. Yeah.
So please, let's go ahead and have you respond to that.
Okay, the question a little bit, you know, in hindsight, if we had known about the COVID crisis, what would be the adaptations made to the GSDR report? And I think, of course, the obvious answer is yes, of course, there needs to be an urgent focus on the health issue, and it can lead, of course, to a competition in terms of attention resources, etc., and that recovery is the first priority. But I think, as the Deputy Secretary General has already pronounced it very eloquently, we can not only focus now on the health issue, but we have to keep the bigger picture in mind and build back better. This will be probably the best also recipe against the COVID crisis or future pandemics. I think there are two reasons that I see. One, of course, is that the current health crisis is translating into economic crisis and most likely would translate into a political crisis. And the other thing is that perhaps what we saw with these systemic approaches, that of course the health issue is intrinsically linked to any other SDGs, and it will have more impacts, but it can also be contained only through interventions on these things that interact with the global health. But of course, one perhaps small correction I would make, and when you were writing the GSDR, it was almost hard to use the R word, the R word that states should regulate, that states play really a role in defining those rules of the game. And what we are seeing now, of course, is that everybody is watching towards states and their cooperation and is asking them to be courageous, to have plans that they can pull out of the drawer. And I think that's perhaps an important sign that the importance of guidance through the public sector is absolutely key towards the future. And the second question that was also there, and it relates a little bit to the first one, but specifically asked if the 10 priority areas align with the GSDR. And I would just like to say, of course, the Secretary General's report of last year, the special progress report, and the GSDR were designed to be complementary. So I would more asking the question of science towards the change and the implementation, whereas the progress report is more really taking stock of where we exactly stand. But I think towards the end, and when it comes to also these 10 priority areas, we saw a very, very nice alignment of things. And of course, the leaving no one behind and building a more resilient planet is the overarching paradigm of the 2030 agenda. But what I think is really interesting is that many of these other fields, for example, strengthening institutions, mobilizing financing, working with data and SDI, and solving the challenges through international cooperation, these are exactly the fields what we call levers. We add, the civil society additionally, but this really aligns with that. And finally, also the call for more concrete local action. I think that's exactly what we say. Even if we want to achieve universal transformation, we must work at local level and find those pathways which respond to the needs and priorities, but at the same time contribute to the universal transformations of these key systems that we need to change if we want to achieve the 2030 change. That would be my short response.
Thank you very much, Professor Maserli. Ambassador Young, would you like to weigh in on any of that? I think that one question that is on the chat board is, how can the UN keep up the momentum to ramp up the decade of action in the context of COVID-19 pandemic? And also there's a second part to that question, is there perfect matching between the decade of action, 10 priority areas, and the proposed 6 entry points for transformation? I'm inviting Ambassador Young.
Well, I'll try. The first one is what again? Because I don't have the chat.
I see. So I'm sorry. Yes, it says, how can the UN keep up the momentum to ramp up the decade of action in the context of COVID-19 pandemic? In other words, we see the pandemic as a major threat to the decade of action. How can we overcome that threat?
I think that the UN, I know that the UN has been holding these virtual meetings. There is no other way except to continue with the UN agenda as much as possible by using our virtual means. And there's this discussion going on right now in the General Committee on how to move forward with the agenda, on how to vote and how to do things. But there is an agenda for the UN, and as much as it can be followed virtually, it should be followed. One thing I will say is that I think that the UN's IT system might need to be upgraded in order to handle that level of meeting that is necessary to continue with its agenda. But I understand that they're looking at it. It will have a cost. everything has a cost. So it'll come back to member states that we have to decide on whether we want to invest. We should have had this redundancy system in place for a long time. As somebody said previously in one of the discussions, we've been, oh, I think it was Professor, that 10 years ago we were warned that there would be a pandemic. You know, but of course, nobody took any heed of that. But now is the time.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I will just take one last question and then we will wrap up this part of the discussion. And there was a question specifically about data and statistics. How can we overcome the gaps in data and statistics, especially in the context of the GSDR, the preparation of the GSDR. And so I'd like to ask Professor Maserli if he has a response to that, and Ambassador Young, if you'd like to weigh in as well. Professor Maserli?
Yeah, I think there are perhaps two parts to it. I think the
Yes.
question is how did the GSDR deal with it? And of course, it is a report which is at global level and brings together the available knowledge. But indeed, we had to dive much deeper into regional context. And there we're trying to assemble, you know, in each continent, experts to get also their knowledge into the GSDR, that we have fair assessment of these things. But perhaps more importantly, and that was perhaps my last slide in the presentation, there is of course a hugely alarming and unequal access to knowledge and scientific capacities in so many countries. It is blocked by paywalls, but it's also of course the lack of tertiary academic personnel, etc. So it's a huge issue. And I would say there is a whole long list of very short-term remedies we can take. We have to tear down those paywalls. We have to make data open access. There is a lot of knowledge, but it's fragmented, but not available. So there is still a lot of work to be done to avail that knowledge also to all these countries. But I would say, of course, there is also a medium-term strategy needed, is that we have these partnerships in science that bring education in tertiary level into these countries, that we build up the competence, and especially in development cooperation, we have not seen that. It has been only in primary and vocational trainings, but we need a massive moonshot mission to provide this scientific capacity in an equitable way to all those countries, so we can create the innovation that we need from every country.
Thank you very much, Professor. Your response was like music to my ears. Ambassador Young?
Music to my ears too, Neil. I totally agree with Professor. I mean, I can't better it. That it just, you know, data, statistics. Look, right now in New York, they're saying we can't open up because we need to have data and statistics on what's going on with COVID before we open up our economy. If they don't have it here, what do you think of us in the developing countries? So what Professor said is right on point. And I love what you said about partnership in science, Professor. Partnership is the key. All these young people here, we need partnerships in developing our statistical capacity. It's a great idea. I can't better what you said.
Thank you.
And that's a very happy and harmonious note on which I could then thank our two excellent presenters for sharing their expertise, their knowledge, and their passion with all of us. There may be other questions that we've not been able to address. We've run out of time. But we did alert you, the colleagues, at the start of this session, that questions that are not addressed in this interactive discussion, we can either come to them later before we close, or subsequently we'll have them posted and find ways to deal with them. My sincere thanks on behalf of the organizers to both of you, Ambassador Young and Professor Maserli, for being here with us today. We will now move immediately to the second part of this session, and I would like to do a blanket introduction of our speakers and presenters in this session, and ask them in that order to present on their respective topics. We will first hear from Mr. Marcus Riesel, who's the counselor at the Permanent Mission of Switzerland to the UN. We'll hear from Ms. Marion Barthélemy, the Director in the Office for Intergovernmental Support and Coordination for Sustainable Development at UNDESA. And we will hear from Miss Michelle Giles McDonough, the Director for the Sustainable Development Unit in the Office of the Executive Office of the Secretary General. Michelle will wrap everything together for us in a nice package and focus on the overview of reform efforts to reposition the UN development system. First, we will hear from the first two speakers who will address the question of the QCPR, the evolution of member states' guidance to the UN development system. Marcus, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot for giving me the floor, and I hand the floor immediately to Marion, because we said that we will share this presentation together, also in order to save a little bit of time. Marion, please start.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Neil. And I would like to thank also Marco, UNITAR, and Switzerland also for the co-organizers for this training, and Switzerland for their generous support. During this session, what we wanted to do is to demystify a little bit the QCPR ahead of the next review that will be conducted this fall, as you know. And the QCPR basically is the tool for the member states to give their guidance to the UN system on how it works to support the program countries. Traditionally, it's been more about the effectiveness, coherence, efficiency of the UN development system. But with the 2016 QCPR, it also became a lot about how the UN system is supporting the developing countries in implementing the 2030 agenda and the impact it's having. So it's the DSG, I think, used the word murky for the acronym. It's a bit of an obscure acronym, QCPR. So we wanted to start by saying what it means. So the Q stands for quadrennial. And the ambassador of Switzerland at the beginning reminded us that the QCPR started actually 40 years ago. And it used to be triennial, it became quadrennial in 2012. And the reason was to align it with the cycle of the strategic plans of the funds and programs, so that it could have an impact on the elaboration of the plans of the funds, programs, and other entities, actually. The C is for comprehensive. It's the resolution that provides strategic guidance to the UN development system as a whole, and not only to parts of it. P is for policy. So in principle, the QCPR gives the policy orientations for the development cooperation of the UN system. And this was reinforced with the last QCPR in 2016. But the QCPR also includes very down-to-earth practical operational aspects, such as business operations, for example, which take some space in the resolution. And I agree also with the ambassador and with Marcus that it's important to stay also as in the balloon to keep the overview of the whole resolution and not get lost in the nitty-gritties. And the R is for review. So it implies that the QCPR is actually has an evaluative function. It aims to hold the UN system accountable on whether it implemented the guidance of the member states. And this guidance is contained in the QCPR resolution, but also in other resolutions, such as the one on the repositioning of the UN development system 72 to 79. So who conducts this review? It's conducted itself, the QCPR, by the General Assembly, but its implementation is reviewed by ECOSOC every year in the operational activities segment. And the review is based on analysis and evidence that is collected in the Secretary General's report. DESA conducts surveys of program countries, resident coordinators. We get inputs from the UN system. There used to be country visits. And what's important is there is a monitoring and reporting framework with indicators on all the mandates that serves as a basis for the Secretary General's report and the review. And as the DSG said, the report for the QCPR this year will be released shortly. Let me talk now to this slide about UN development system and UN SDG. So the QCPR applies to what we call the UN development system, but actually there hasn't been a systematic definition of the UN development system. Generally, it refers to the entities that carry out operational activities for development, and those are defined as activities that UN entities carry out for the promotion of the development and the welfare of developing countries. And this includes both activities with a long-term development purpose, but also humanitarian assistance. We've used the definition in the Secretary General's report, and the UN development system consists of 38 entities. At the global level, as you see on the chart, we have the UN Sustainable Development Group, which encompasses those entities. And this group is the internal coordination mechanism of the UN development system. It's currently, the new system is that it's chaired by the Deputy Secretary General, and the core group is chaired by the administrator of UNDP. And the UN SDG develops system-wide policies, and it also provides guidance and oversight on coordination issues. I want to emphasize that this UN SDG is a very important tool for ensuring that the UN development system implements the guidance of the member states, because it translates the resolution, which is at a very high level, you know, of policy, into something that's actionable by the UN system, you know, operational guidance, policies, and tools. But it also has its own initiative, and just now it developed a framework for the response to COVID-19. And maybe it's a place where it could look also at the longer term and the findings of science, like we were just discussing now, that there are things that are predicted by science and academia, and the UN system should get ready to respond, and probably UN SDG would be the right place. I wanted to move to the next slide, which is about the roles and the responsibilities related to the QCPR. So to whom does the QCPR applies to? So it's the funds and programs that depend on the General Assembly. And it also applies to the specialized agencies. They are strongly encouraged to implement the QCPR. And this was reinforced in 2016, actually, the application of the QCPR to the specialized agencies. Then there is an architecture to follow up on the QCPR. The funds and the programs are to report to their board on their implementation of the QCPR, and the member state in the respective executive boards are to ensure that the entity they oversee implements the QCPR. I didn't mention the role of my department, which is actually to also prepare those reports on the QCPR, which are then, you know, reviewed and revised by the SG's office. I wanted also to clarify the respective roles of the GA and the ECOSOC. So the General Assembly is where the policy orientations are developed for the UN development system through the QCPR, but also other resolutions like on the repositioning. And what ECOSOC does is to annually review the implementation of those GA resolutions. The review takes place in the operational activities segment, which is held in May. This year, the segment is chaired by the Vice President of Mexico, who is the Deputy Permanent Representative of Mexico. And at the moment, the Bureau is reviewing the format of the segment. And I saw that Diego from Mexico is online, and he may say more about the reflection in the Bureau and in the Secretariat on the format of the segment. And the General Assembly looks at the operational activities every year, and the QCPR every 4 years in the second committee. It has discussions in October. Then there is a GA resolution, which is prepared by the G77, which is negotiated and adopted in December. And I'm particularly glad that we have Marcus here, because Switzerland has very often served as the facilitator for the QCPR resolutions, which is a huge undertaking. Just next slide is about why the QCPR is important. And one of the key factors is that it makes the UN system work as a system. As you know, it was created as a very decentralized architecture, with each agency having its own governing body. So the QCPR is a way to bring all those organizations to work together in a coherent way around the coherent objectives, now the 2030 agenda. Also, I mean, the way it's ensured is actually what I was referring to earlier, is one of the means is that the QCPR guides the elaboration of the strategic plans of the funds and programs. What made the QCPR even more important was the adoption of the 2030 agenda, because it is to ensure now that the UN development system adequately supports the member states in pursuing the 2030 agenda. And there is a link between the high-level political forum on sustainable development, which is the central platform to review progress on the 2030 agenda as a whole, and the QCPR. The QCPR is held the year after the HLPF meets as a summit and adopts a political declaration on the implementation of the whole 2030 agenda. And then immediately after, the QCPR is to develop guidance to the UN system on how to implement the declaration and the guidance of the HLPF. Finally, the QCPR is important also at the country level, because it has established the role of the resident coordinator and the repositioning resolution. It was one of the key transformative also aspects, this increase in the leadership of the resident coordinator, which really brings the country team together to respond to the needs of the country through the cooperation framework. So I let Marcus continue from there.
Yes, thanks, Marion, for starting this presentation, and welcome, colleagues, to this training. I think what we have is what is mentioned on the slide is 4-year cycles. The UN development system is working in cycles of 4 years, 4 years from the Agenda 2030, as Marion mentioned, this HLPF every 4 years, the QCPR every 4 years, and also the strategic plans of the funds and programs every 4 years. And have the next slide, please. And we try to put that a little bit in a scheme that looks a little bit complicated, but you have the QCPR this year, 2020, and it is then unrolling towards next year's ECOSOC OAS, Operational Activities segment, and also within the cycle of the General Assembly, meaning the second committee. So every year there is a kind of a discussion as well as in the ECOSOC in green, as in the General Assembly marked in red. And you see also what is discussed and will be decided in the QCPR by the end of this year will also kind of, together with what the funds and programs evaluate from their midterm review and their current strategy, will flow into their strategies starting in 2022. So that's a little bit the whole scheme of cascade, how the system works together, which is sometimes a little bit hard to find. Can I have the next slide, please? And let's have a look now at the current QCPR, which is basically a rather short one compared to the former QCPRs, which had over 180 articles and paras. So this one is quite short, very much based on the Agenda 2030, and of course with highlighting the need for a system-wide approach for coherence, for more collaboration, and the funding as one of the main aspects. And of course, and it is highlighted in red, the 5th chapter, improving the functioning of the UN development system, where you have then as a follow-up, and we'll come to that, this resolution of the repositioning that has been mentioned several times now. That's that as a kind of a follow-up to the QCPR. And you have these different documents that we are also familiar, that you see in red at the right-hand side of the slide. The system-wide strategic document, the funding compact, is basically rooted in the QCPR decision. And we have some responsibilities for example, the cost recovery issues, or the funding, mobilizing multiple funding sources. These are the issues that are discussed in the executive boards of the respective funds and programs and UN agencies. And we have this kind of still ongoing things like the MCO, the multi-country office review, and the regional collaborative platforms. These are basically also mandates given by the QCPR that are currently still pending. Can I have the next, please? So maybe a word to the resolution 72-279, this repositioning, which is basically a little bit the reform agenda. We kicked off the whole RC system, but we have to reflect a little bit deeper and see that the starting point was the elaboration of the Agenda 2030. And even before this agenda has been adopted, ECOSOC dialogue with analysis and experts started in order to make the system fit for this revolutionary agenda. And of course, also the Secretary General's progress report was a key document before finally in the QCPR some key decisions has been taken, and businesses, and I will come to that in the next slide, also as a fourth step in this resolution. And just let me highlight a couple of things. You see this kind of how these documents have been elaborated. You have, for example, in the QCPR, the request to the Secretary General to present a comprehensive proposal to strengthening resident coordinator system. This has been kind of done in the resolution 72-279, that the report has been, or the proposal has been taken up. And it is led then to the implementation plan, which has been elaborated also together with member states in order to start the whole RC system, as we all know, at the beginning of last year. A second issue or example is to introduce or strengthen knowledge management strategies and policies. That's also a QCPR request. And the resolution of the repositioning mentioned it to address gaps and overlaps in the regional level. And what we have is the current debate, and also we are all waiting of the final proposals from the SG in this report that we will see one of these days on the regional review. And of course, the funding compact is another of these documents that have been already elaborated over the 2018-2019 and approved by the ECOSOC. And we're still waiting for the last pending issue, as the DSG mentioned in the very beginning, the system-wide strategic document, which should help us put all these different things together and create this coherence and collaboration spirit that we all want to implement the agenda. Next slide, please. So we still have some challenges for the UNDS reform. This Agenda 2030 is going beyond traditional development activities. And as we also heard from Peter Messerli today, these trade-offs, these kind of contradictions between the SDGs, the different SDGs have to be tackled. We still have to finish the business of the UNDS reform. Not again another reform process, but basically where it is, it's the implementation that is at hand now, that is asked. What steps needs to be taken to implement and what decisions needs to be taken. I think the governance structure has always been a challenge for the UN system, and Marion mentioned it with the governance structures of the different funds and programs and the different entities. It's a grown system which has also grown governance structures, which is not that easy to establish a kind of a overall leadership. But I would say if we look at how the UN responds now to the COVID under the leadership of the RC, I'm quite pleased to see how this governance structure is taking form and taking shape. The funding compact is still just a paper where we have to live up to the agreed commitments, both the UN system but also member states. And of course, for the COVID-19 is a major challenge for the whole system. And here also we see at least that parts of the response of the COVID-19 is also being a nexus between the development and the humanitarian, and at this time it's more with the socio-economic dimension of development, but ultimately also the nexus between development, humanitarian and peace building is a challenge for the whole UNDS system, and I would say the UN as a whole. And of course we may ask the question whether the QCPR will be able to address all these challenges. I'm not sure, and we have to think, as also the DSG mentioned, that not necessarily what is in this year's QCPR, which is basically a continuation of the business that is at hand, but seeing a little bit broader, and hopefully we are all capable and competent balloon farers by the end of this year. And maybe next slide, please. That will be my last slide. Some personal inputs. I think and it has been mentioned by Ambassador Young, this climate change will stay, whether we have a COVID crisis or not. The whole repositioning of the RC system, we're not done yet, but it's in the making. We're still struggling with the core resources that are decreasing, unfortunately, in order to support the UN system. As I mentioned, the COVID-19 is and its impact, its socio-economic impact, not necessarily its immediate response that is necessary. And also what is necessary, and here I also refer to what Peter Messerli just said, these partnerships that outside the UN between private sector, but also academic and the civil society, the UN member states and so on, will be key for having a successful QCPR. And next slide, last one, I won't go into the details because my main message is don't make it too complicated. The challenges at hand is to make kind of a comprehensive next QCPR without a too complicated way, so that it is understandable for both the system and the member states to come up with their specific roles and responsibilities. So with that, I leave it to the next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for the reassurance you gave us about not making that last slide too complicated. My head was spinning just looking at it. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we're running short of time, and in order to save time and keep everything together in a coherent manner, I would like to invite Ms. Michelle Giles McDonald to make a presentation to us. I also want to frame that by recalling what the DSG said to us this morning, that we have to make that important shift from architecture and reform issues that have been around for the last 4 years to now moving the focus to the strategic and policy oriented issues. And Michelle will help us to bring everything together in that way. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Neil. And thanks. It's really a pleasure to be on this call with so many participants. I found it a very interesting morning. I had other meetings to zip in and out, and now I have apologies to make because I've spent quite a bit of my time just because I think this has been a very, very important conversation and quite a good one. And I'm appreciative for also what I've learned listening to everyone here today. So let me thank UNITAR and also just echo my colleagues in our appreciation to Switzerland as well for its support for making this possible. As you said, Neil, we've heard from the DSG, we've heard from Professor Messerly and a number of our colleagues and delegations. And the Deputy Secretary General, she gave, I think, quite a pointed and clear overview of the effort that has been undertaken since 2017 to reform and evolve the system, the UN development system, in order to be able to better help countries in the lift that this 2030 agenda will require. I'm in awe every time I listen to Professor Messerly because I think he's one that really explains both the promise but the challenge of this agenda in a way that gives its importance, shows how integrated the different elements are, and therefore it implies the difference in behavior that's necessary and policies and actions, both at country level and therefore similarly with the UN system, if we are to accompany countries in this journey to 2030. And so what I want to focus on now, having listened to this, is how we will leverage these reforms now, how these reforms will help us, help the UN development system to maximize the contribution we can make in supporting countries through the decade, and particularly as we look ahead to the 2020 QCPR and that additional guidance that the system will need from member states in order to do this. The lift for all countries is huge. It's big for everybody, but it's an even bigger lift for many. We heard Ambassador Young and some of the particular challenges she pointed out with that constituency of countries. And so I think it also puts into focus why it was so important to have two core guiding principles from the Secretary General in this development system reform. That it had to focus on national priorities because we have to meet and work with countries from where they are and travel that journey to where we all want to get to. And it therefore has to be context specific. And so everything we have done is to try to make sure that we are rooted in the pathway each and every country will take, and none of those pathways will look the same. So if I start with three foundational points to make the bridge from the reform into the decade. The first is that a better contribution from the UN to the decade of action will come from maximizing the approved reforms, from leveraging the assets across the UN better, organizing those assets to be able to respond to those country priorities, regardless of presence. It's about getting the ideas and the knowledge together in a way that best supports countries and delivering those results for people and for the planet. I liked Professor Messerly's point about this is a knowledge-based transformation. And so And the UN is a place that has vast amount of knowledge, excellent stuff. But if we don't organize that and put that at the disposal of countries in a way they can access it and use it, then all that amazing knowledge really is for naught. And that speaks to the elements we've been emphasizing in these reforms. The second point is that not only do we have to maximize the reforms, but we need to fully deliver, and we need to do that in partnership with the countries. We need country support for that. We need to fully deliver on the foundations of the reforms. That is a sustainably funded RC system, the mutual accountability framework that clarifies the roles and responsibilities and the expectations we have of the different entities of the system in supporting countries under the leadership of the RC must be fully delivered. The efficiencies that member states are asking for, the funding compact on both the development system side and the member state side. We've made progress since the compact was agreed, but we've got a long way to go. And of course, the importance of transparency and accountability. This is vital if we're in a knowledge-based transformation. But it is also, we need to account for progress, and we need to account for use of resources, and we want to make sure we can draw the straight line from those resources to the results. The third piece is that it will also require the system, this reformed system, operating at full capacity. We're almost there in terms of implementing the elements of the reform, and we need to now complete those remaining mandates, because this reform is a package and all the pieces need to fit together, and they then need to be fully delivered for us to have a system that can now, in its most effective and efficient way, accompany countries on that journey. So we need to complete the consideration of the regional review. This is vital for the organization of knowledge and assets. We need to complete the strengthening of our multi-country offices. I can't say it more compellingly than Ambassador Young has. Why it is important that that be done. And that strengthening of the multi-country offices goes hand in hand with completion of the regional review. The system-wide document still needs a response from member states, and the proposals that the SG will be making in terms of system-wide evaluation to deal with those issues of transparency and accountability. Now, the system is primed. We've serviced the car, and now that car, you know, it needs to drive. We've got platforms, we've got tools, the priorities of member states are clear. We'll get clearer guidance through the next QCPR, and we need to get to work. And we need to use this system now to make that leap in effort that you know, was being talked about during these conversations. And to make the strongest contribution to the decade, that means we need to look at 4 things that also jumped out of the GSDR and Professor Messerly's presentation. How does the system help in advancing integrated policy support? How do we maximize the offer of the system on major priority issues for countries? How do we move forward on partnerships? This is a hyper-networked world, another conversation we've had this morning, and lift those partnerships to another level. Professor Messerly is absolutely spot on. We all know it, that the public sector alone will not lift this. And we're going to need those multi-stakeholder partnerships. And we will have to work together also to make sure that we can leverage those for the benefit of member states in a way that all member states can be agreeable to the way we do that. And fourth, how to strengthen the connection between the global and the local, because this agenda needs to meet people. So if I take each one of those 4 in turn, on the integrated policy support, as we've discussed, COVID-19 has basically pulled off the Band-Aid. We now are fully aware of our, if I continue with this health analogy, of our pre-existing conditions. And we know that to get this world, both people and planet and everybody, to a healthier place, we're not only going to have to address the pre-existing conditions, but we're going to have to really treat some new stuff. and do that so that we can get onto a more inclusive and sustainable path. So the gross inequalities, including gender inequality, the destruction of the natural environment, the chronic underinvestment we see in social services, especially in health and social protection, the weakness of institutions, and the fragility of the current model of globalization. These are things that we need to work with countries to see how we can help them to tackle. It also, I think the current situation we're going through reveals also the deep imbalance within our current development model between the social, the economic, and the environmental dimensions of sustainable development. And it gives us some insight into the disruption that we will experience through climate chaos without urgent action. So, you know, all of these other emergencies, these pre-existing things that are there that we also can't push to the side and deal with sequentially, we're going to have to take them on together as we move forward. And as we move forward, you know, we will continue to strengthen the capacities of the system to be able to provide that targeted policy advice to government, and to particularly be helpful in what we know is that very challenging exercise of understanding the synergies and the trade-offs and making those choices about how best resources can be invested, which is the key to acceleration. Having been a resident coordinator, I've seen countries really grapple with how to put that mix together, how to sequence things, and how to make sure that by dealing with one issue, you're not walking back on something else, and how to make sure money that's put in is actually able to move several agendas at the same time. It's a very complicated piece of work. Similarly, that integrated effort, I don't know which colleague mentioned, not just on development, but across the humanitarian and development spheres and their connections with peace building and human rights. You know, and we've laid those foundations. The Deputy Secretary General mentioned the Joint Steering Committee on Humanitarian and Development Collaboration, and how that was trying to take out some of these layers, listen more intensely to our resident coordinators and country teams and the governments on the ground, and make sure that those responses are really crafted to what they're experiencing in the moment. The second area, moving on from the integrated policy advice that I had mentioned earlier, was on how to make sure that we maximize our offer on major priorities as we look to the next 10 years. You know, the analysis that DESA has been doing of the QCPR and the SDGs report will be out later today, as the Deputy Secretary General mentioned. And through our discussions and briefings, we flagged that there's some areas that the development system is supporting well, and there's some where, you know, we've been less present previously, or at least not present in the systematic way we need to be in order to help countries. Issues like the economic transformation that is required, climate and environment, where countries are saying we're seeing an appetite for much more support in these areas. On the question of leaving no one behind, and the shortfall in investments in social protection, etc. So with the economic transformation, we're hoping that the new network of economists that DESA is pulling together across the system, I think readying through the regional review and the leadership of the RCs and country teams, the ability of teams to draw on the economic analysis and the work that's done by regional commissions, as well as other agencies, funds, and programs in a more effective way, strengthening the relationships with the international financial institutions. And I think COVID, the COVID challenge we have now is actually helping to push us in that direction, as we have to come together to really address an urgent situation, and then to make sure that we don't fall back after the urgency kind of wanes, and that we continue a strong collaboration and support of countries. We're also seeing already much stronger collaboration across that interagency task force on financing for development that DESA is leading. And so at all those levels, from the global down to the country, to make sure that the teams are better able to support on that economic transformation. The partnership with the EU and working with the World Bank and the IMF and others around integrated national financing frameworks, and to also help that choice matrix that countries have about how best they use limited resources is also quite important. On leaving no one behind, we know that the unfinished business of the MDGs that's carried over into the SDGs. This crisis has told us we've got to up our game on social protection floors, health, education, water and sanitation, all of these things. And then on climate, as I said, the appetite is strong for countries to see much more happening in terms of advice on a sustainable economy, sustainable consumption and production, on biodiversity and oceans and their interaction. Nature forms the foundations of our economy and of our life. And so how we better understand the interactions and the regulatory responsibility of safe and protected ecosystems to ensure both health for people and health for planet is very important. The third piece was on the partnerships, and not just on a specific partnership, on a specific delivery modality, but really how do we shape what multilateralism really looks like? I think this vaccine initiative that was launched this morning speaks to the kind of partnerships that need to be happening at all levels, that we have to find those systems and mechanisms that allow us to embrace and bring in the necessary resources to the table from all spheres to make sure that we can have a sound response. We've moved forward with due diligence guidance in terms of how we engage with the private sector, and with the review of the Global Compact and the UN Office of Partnerships and DESA, and how we're handling partnerships there, because we do need to see a step change if we're going to be able to make that leap in effort that Ambassador Young was talking about. And also the partnerships inside the system. And this is where, again, I think the regional review is vital. These issue-based coalitions, their fundamental premise is that the expertise from different perspectives that reside across the system need to have an easy way to be harnessed and pulled together to focus on a country's problems. And in the same way we bring together our stakeholders from outside, we've got to organize our assets better inside. And then finally, the global to the local. How do we need much more effective international cooperation. Many of these issues, as was alluded to earlier, they cross borders. Whether it's migration, climate, crime, trade, conflict prevention. And so solutions are not single country. On many of these challenges that we face, we have to come together. And so, we need to make the most, I think, of UN 75 and this reflection that we have ahead of us as to how the UN looks and does its work, for the next, 25, 50 years. And on another level, how we better connect up the work of our voluntary national reviews and the high-level political forum and the operational segment, activity segment, to the country level. This is really vital. And I think, as we think and look ahead to the QCPR, these are some of the challenges that we need to think about. The second committee, has a key role to play, as the Deputy Secretary General said. And, the policy guidance and the direction you know, only the General Assembly can provide. And what you can be assured of is that the leadership of the SG and the Deputy Secretary General and working with the system is to make sure that that guidance is implemented and that it is implemented in a way to derive the best benefits possible for the system. So I'll stop there and just say also we look forward to the next conversations that will happen on the QCPR, because I think we have the opportunity in the operational activities segment to really, this is one reform. Being in the UN, we've gone through so many reforms, but I think we can really make the moment of shift from the car service and drive the car out of the shop and to get to that next phase where we can begin the journey now with some concrete strategic and policy guidance from member states to help our work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for delivering so excellently, bringing together for us the whole QCPR process, which our colleagues who spoke before you presented on, both the history and the current context, but for you to also wrap that around the reform and repositioning of the UN development system and the charge that was given to us by the Deputy Secretary General. You've really brought this together very well. Today has been a very intense morning. I think, colleagues, you have quite a lot to chew on and to digest. But before we get into specific questions and the Q&A interactive session, let me urge those who are connected to post their questions on the chat box and we can pick them up from there. And while you're getting your thoughts around what your questions might be, I would like to invite our colleague from the Permanent Mission of Mexico, Diego, who, as was announced earlier on, whose office will be spearheading the QCPR process. Diego, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Neil, and good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. First of all, I would like to start, and it will take me only 2 or 3 minutes for what I would like to say, to thank UNITAR and Switzerland for putting together these sessions. I think that they are going to be extremely useful as we embark in the upcoming negotiations of the QCPR. And thank you also to Mariam for mentioning the operational activity segment, which is coming very soon. As you know, Ambassador Juan Sandoval from Mexico is chairing the operational activity segment. It was supposed to take place from 19 to 21 May, and but certainly COVID-19 and the fact that we are not in the building has made things a little bit more difficult. So we have to make things a little bit different in this sense. And what is important regarding the operational activity segment is that we are trying to send the message of business continuity. Of course, technology is going to be an extremely good ally in this endeavor, as today, as this webinar has shown today. And I think that I will also quote the DSG when she was saying that the resident coordinators and country teams have been in the front line when it comes to the battle against COVID-19. And therefore, this is the reason why we extremely need to have the operational activity segment to also send the message. We know that the system is working and we need to continue giving guidance to the system in order for it to grapple and continue confronting the pandemic in all our countries. As you know, I talked to many of the member states before we started confinement to gather their views on what they wanted from the operational activity segment. I'm quite happy that I was able to talk to many of you. And I really think that in general, the message that we got is the same message that Michelle was mentioning regarding the transparency and accountability of the system. And the operational activity segment is precisely the space where we are going to be getting the information from the system on how they are coming together. And certainly, I think that what we have been hearing regarding the response to COVID-19. We created a task force that included DCO, DESA, the DSG's office, Norway as the presidency of ECOSOC and Mexico to try to put together a program. We are finalizing with the different adjustments that we will have to do in order to have the virtual meetings of the operational activities segment. Our intention is that it is going to take place during the same week as the operational activity segment was supposed to take place, which is the week of 18 May to the 22nd. And we have been gathering all the different comments. We have been listening to the different member states. So we are going to try to include as many of those elements. I would beg the indulgence of all member states because we will, of course, with the modalities, it is not going to be possible to include every single aspect that everybody wanted, but we are trying to put together the most important things so that everybody gets the answers that we are all seeking from the system. Certainly, something that was mentioned throughout this morning is the outstanding mandates, the MCO review, and the regional dimension. I can assure everyone that that is going to be part of the program, as well as some of the other topics that have been mentioned. So I will keep it here. Hopefully next week we will be able to get something out for all member states to digest. And pretty much what I would beg is the patience and the indulgence of everyone, just trying to see that we are making an effort to put together meetings that are as good as possible in the current context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diego, for really giving us the context against which the operational activities segment is being planned and prepared. And I also have to correct myself because I said your ambassador is going to be responsible to QCPR. It is the operational activities segment that includes the QCPR and everything else that segment will be responsible for. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to the end of our program. I have not seen any new questions posted. Let me check in with our administrators in the background. Do we have any questions? Pelayo or Amy? Seems like we do not. No, thank you then. Thank you very much, Pelayo. At this time, I would then like to invite, in fact, Marianne, Marcus, and Michelle, if you have any parting thoughts to leave with us for 1 minute each, and then I will hand the floor back to Marco Suazo to bring this to an end. Marianne?
Yes, just to make a link between what Michel said and the presentation about the GSDR. I think for the coming QCPR, the support of the UN system to integrated policies by the countries to implement the 2030 agenda, that would be an important topic, and it requires, to mobilize the whole of the UN system to look at those SDGs, their interlinkages, and it requires very focused cooperation on those areas where you have the kind of synergies and trade-offs that the professor was mentioning. So I think for the next QCPR, it's really something that would be a good focus and will allow to move a bit from how the system works to what it does to support the countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Marcus?
Yeah, maybe
any parting thoughts?
Yeah, okay, thanks. Maybe just one reflection. I think listening to all the challenges ahead, and especially these trade-offs from Peter Messerli, but also the current debate that we are in on the system-wide document, the review, and so on. All these open questions. My message would be that we have to find a good balance between stick to concepts and what has been proven good, but also have the courage to try and error, or try something and then come back if it doesn't work. I think, as Michel has a little bit mentioned, that sometimes we cannot wait until we have the final answer in order to start. We have to try, also have the courage to try something, and then make sure that we have the necessary monitoring function so that we can kind of overlook and oversee where things are working good, and where we make progress, and where we may have to adapt a little bit or correct or do some corrections. And that's something that we need to apply. If everyone sticks to its kind of current position, then we will not manage to have a kind of a consensus. And that's what we all want, and I would love to see a kind of a QCPR that is giving the necessary guidance and giving also the necessary stability to the whole system.
Marcus, thank you very much. Michelle, would you like to add any closing perspectives?
Thank you, Neil. And just to take off from Marcus, there's a lot of discussion now about adjusting to the new normal. But what we need to do is not adjust to the new normal, but to reimagine the new normal. Unfortunately, member states have already done a lot of this imagining. That's in the 2030 agenda. We now just have to do. And so I think, you know, our role as a system is to work, you know, with countries to protect what we have, brace against the impact of this current crisis, recover, and continue the journey. And in order to do that, we've spent a lot of very hard work and investment, and we need to work with an architecture that is far moved on from where we had it in 2017, and give that architecture the chance now to deliver on the substance of the work that needs to be done with a little bit of a boost, and then come back and review it in 2021, as member states have said. But I really hope that we can make this pivot, because the needs out there are so urgent, glaring before everybody's eyes. If they were glaring before, but now we've got a magnifying glass. So that's my hope. Thanks.
Michelle, thank you very much. That was a very positive tone and hope. And I think it also spoke to a question that I just saw pop up on the screen, which was really about how long do we think it will take to move from this negative trajectory and the reversal of gains to moving forwards. I don't think anyone can really accurately say how long this will take. None of us have a crystal ball. But what we can say is precisely what you just said, Michelle. What we can say is what it is we need to do, which is, from the perspective of the UN system, make a stronger UN system, a more coordinated, a more efficient, and a more effective UN system. We've been working on that for the past number of years, 4 years or so. This time, it's really not business as usual. We're poised. We're really poised to take it to the next level, to make that leap that I think was a thread that ran throughout all of the presentations this morning. We know what the challenges are, but we know what we have to do, and we know what we have already done. It's really getting us from what we've done to where we want to be, to do what needs to be done. I thank you all, presenters and panelists. Let me pass the microphone back to our chairman, Mr. Ambassador Marco Suazo.
If you don't mind, I will exit so I don't miss another meeting.
You're very welcome.
Thank you all so very much.
Thank you for your presence. Bye. Marco?
Thank you very much. I'll be very, very brief.
Voicing what I think many colleagues are.
Just wanted to thank you, Neil, for this stewardship of the panel. Remarkable, well done. We are very pleased and very proud of your work. I wanted actually also to give a special thanks to our panelists, especially for Professor Peter Meselli, for Marion Berthelemy, for Marcus, for Michelle, for Ambassador Pedro Belis, that she already left, Ambassador Young, because as a kickoff start of these modules, it shows how important this process it is, and it shows also the interest of member states on following it. So we have been talking about the pandemic, and this has disrupted a little bit our calendar of work, but it is not destroyed. We will continue to do this. We will convene our steering committee, which basically is online now, next week, to plan for the next session that hopefully we can make it by May. Please stay put. We will put all this information in the journal, in the e-delegates, in the e-journal. You will receive written communications by email about the new program, the new session, the new date, and the panelists per se. So I am wanting also to express all the people that has been behind this first video conference on QCPR. because we achieved at a certain moment more than 200 participants, actually 225 at a certain moment. And I'm talking about Sina Monla from the UNDESA, from Martina, from Emanuela, also from the UNITAR team, Palayo, Harris, Tianji. Thank you very much for making this possible. Finally, I wanted to say that I am very happy and I'm very proud. It's true that we are not seeing each other face to face, but we can work, we can achieve a result, and this is what we are looking for. And so from the comfort of our homes, maybe we can be a little more creative and innovative. For all the participants that has been listening through the whole morning, if there is any particular issue or any suggestion you can make to us to improve the service, please let us know. You have our coordinates, and we will be very happy and very ready to try to fulfill those requests. This session has been recorded. If we put it on the UNITAR website, we will also produce all the package of the presentations will be available also in the UNITAR website, and you will be able to download them and the factual recording of the session. So wait for our email in a couple of days, and then you will have access to all these documentation and information. I will ask for a round of applause, but it's very difficult to do it at this point. But I really thank you, Marcus and Zina, for the effort and putting us together all this. Thank you very much, and I wish you a happy weekend to all of you. And as I said at the beginning, also a peaceful Ramadan for that we started today. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. I'll see you soon, and please keep in touch for the next session. We will inform you when it comes. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.